So picture this. It's the summer of 1940. Nearly all of Europe is crushed under Hitler's boot. He turns his gaze across the English Channel to his very last enemy, a stubborn little island standing completely alone. The battle that came next wasn't fought on land, it wasn't fought at sea, it was fought in the skies. And it would become Hitler's first great defeat, a turning point that changed everything in the Second World War.
So how in the world did this incredible victory even happen? Well, that's what we're going to break down. First, we'll look at just how desperate Britain's situation was. Then, we'll get into the brutal numbers game they were facing. We'll chart the furious battle for air supremacy, see how a fatal German mistake completely turned the tide, and finally, really grasp why this one single battle was so incredibly decisive.
You have to understand, after the shocking collapse of France in June 1940, Britain's situation looked hopeless. The army had just barely escaped at Dunkirk, but they left almost all of their heavy weapons and equipment behind on the beaches. A German invasion didn't just seem possible, it felt like it was going to happen any day.
Now, you'd think the German Air Force, the Luftwaffe, was invincible after crushing France. But here's something really interesting. They hadn't come out of that fight completely unscathed. In just 5 weeks of fighting, they lost nearly 1,000 combat planes. And look, those aren't just nuts and bolts. Every one of those planes had an experienced crew that you couldn't just replace overnight.
Militarily, Britain was completely on the ropes. The real game changer came on May 10th, when Winston Churchill became Prime Minister. His absolute bulldog refusal to even consider negotiating with Hitler just electrified the country. This new spirit was so obvious that even the Soviet ambassador in London wrote back to Moscow about this. Cold British berserker rage. Britain wasn't going to surrender. Britain was getting ready to fight.
Okay, but guts and glory only gets you so far, right? You gotta look at the numbers. Because on paper, the odds facing Britain looked, well, they looked absolutely impossible.
On one side, the Germans could put about 2,400 combat-ready planes in the air. Bombers, dive bombers, the whole shebang. And what did Britain's Royal Air Force have to counter that? Just 720 fighters. You do the math, that's a more than 3-to-1 disadvantage. It's insane.
But the real problem, the critical weakness, wasn't even the planes. It was the pilots. The RAF had only about 1,430 trained fighter pilots ready to go. And these guys were kids, most of them. The average age was just 20 years old. You see, you can build a new Spitfire in a few weeks, but it takes months, sometimes years, to train a combat-ready pilot. Losing a pilot was a devastating blow the RAF could barely afford.
But Britain had an ace up its sleeve. Under the absolutely ferocious leadership of the new Minister of Aircraft Production, a guy named Lord Beaverbrook, British factories performed a miracle. In July 1940 alone, they produced 496 brand new fighters. Germany, with all its supposed industrial might, only managed 173. So while Britain was getting outfought in the air, it was starting to win the war on the factory floor. And Churchill's famous few weren't all British. Not by a long shot. In fact, 1 out of every 5 pilots who flew in the battle was a volunteer from another country. The biggest group came from Poland. These were veteran pilots who'd escaped the invasion of their own country, and they fought with this incredible ferocity. Get this, the top-scoring squadron in the entire battle, 303 Squadron, was Polish.
So, the German plan was brutally simple. Before they could even think about sending invasion barges across the channel, they had to achieve total air superiority. Their goal was to just smash the RAF to bits, wipe out its airfields, its radar stations, and its planes right there on the ground in southern England. The main assault kicked off in mid-August, and it was just this relentless, grinding battle of attrition. Day after day, hundreds of German bombers and fighters came over. August 15th became known as Black Thursday for the Germans. They lost 75 planes in a single day. But the pressure on the RAF was immense, and by the end of August, it was on the verge of total collapse. The head of RAF Fighter Command, a man named Hugh Dowding, came up with a strategy that was really controversial at the time, but honestly, it was brilliant. Instead of sending up huge formations to meet the Germans, a big slugfest he knew he'd lose, he sent up small groups, small packets of fighters, to harass and break up the raids. It saved his precious pilots and planes, and it made sure the RAF could never be wiped out in one big, catastrophic fight.
But the fact that the RAF just refused to be destroyed was driving the German High Command crazy. And that frustration led the head of the Luftwaffe, Hermann Göring, to make a fatal mistake. An error that gave Britain's fighter command the exact breathing room it so desperately needed.
On September 7th, everything changed. The Luftwaffe switched its main target.
They stopped focusing on the RAF airfields and instead started bombing the city of London directly. The Blitz had begun. So the German thinking was pretty straightforward. They figured bombing London would do two things. One, it would terrorize the people into submission. And two, and this was the crucial part, it would force Dowding to send up every last fighter he had to defend the capital. This, they thought, would finally give them the single, decisive air battle they've been looking for. And it's this moment, this desperate defense against such incredible odds, that inspired Churchill's most famous words, where he immortalized those young pilots as the few.
Okay, so this all comes to a head on one single day, Sunday, September 15th. The Germans, believing the RAF was down to its last handful of planes, launched a massive daylight assault on London. This was supposed to be the final knockout blow. But instead of a shattered, broken enemy, the Germans were met by a storm of fighters. That brief break from attacks on their airfields was all the RAF needed to repair, reorganize, and get back in the fight. They met the German raid in massive force, and the losses they inflicted were crippling. You can just imagine the shock for the German pilots. They'd been told the RAF was finished, but here it was, stronger than ever. The psychological blow was just immense.
The absolute mauling the Luftwaffe took on September 15th, that was the breaking point. They had failed to control the skies over Britain, and the consequences of that failure would change the entire course of the war.
The final numbers here really tell the story. Yeah, aircraft losses were high on both sides, but look at the human cost. If a British pilot bailed out, he landed in his own backyard and could be back in the fight the next day. But if a German crew went down, they were either killed or captured. For every one pilot the RAF lost, the Luftwaffe lost more than 6. You just can't sustain a war with those kinds of losses. And the fallout was immediate. Just 2 days after that huge battle, Hitler officially postponed the invasion of Britain indefinitely. It was basically a quiet admission that he had been defeated. His whole strategy was in ruins. So, stuck in a dead end, he turned his attention east. By December, he was signing the directive for Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union. So you see, this victory did so much more than just save Britain from invasion. It guaranteed the war would go on. It made sure Britain would be the unsinkable aircraft carrier for the eventual liberation of Europe. And it forced Hitler into a two-front war, a strategic nightmare that would ultimately destroy him. Which leaves us with one last big question. In those desperate summer skies of 1940, did those few hundred pilots not only save their country, but did they also seal the fate of the Third Reich itself?